order, good morning. Our chair has asked if I can open our session today, so I've thought I'd open it today but give a thought about tomorrow. There's a universal karakia which I've put up the top, and because it's about submissions in regard to the port, I added a little bit just down the bottom which I'll read through. You're welcome to join me in terms of opening this session. Whakataka te hau ki te uru, whakataka te hau ki te tonga. Kia mā kina kina kiuta, kia mā taratara ki tai. E hia kia na te atakura, he teo, he huka, he hauhu, tihei mauri ora. Cease the winds from the west, cease the winds from the south. Let the breeze blow over the land, let the breeze blow over the ocean. Let the red-tipped dawn come with a sharpened ear, a touch of frost, a promise of a glorious day. And from Travis Bradbury, people like to know you're listening, and something as simple as a clarification question shows not only that you're listening, but that you also care about what they're saying. You'll be surprised how much respect and appreciation you gain just by asking good questions. And with that, thank you.
Hello.
Thank you, Paddy. That's much appreciated. Now, we're going to get started at 9:10 with Bill, but before we do that, that's a long session, team, and we've got to try and keep the timetable. So I'm just wondering whether you're going to keep the timetable and give us a minute to go, so people know a minute, and then when it's over.
Yes.
The other thing that I would like to say is that this is an opportunity for the public to come and have their say. It's not an opportunity for councillors to have their say. So if we could keep, people are going to say things which you agree with or you don't agree with. But if we could keep our thoughts to ourselves for later, that would be greatly appreciated, because we want to make sure that this is an opportunity that the public have their say, and it's only 10 minutes, and they own that 10 minutes. So if we could be very conscious of that, thanks. Okay, do we have any conflict of interest today? Seems to be the...
Any conflicts, Tom?
Tom admits to conflicts, but just not of interest. We've got him on the record for that.
So there are no conflict of interest today. We all have our thoughts, of course.
And then we just need to resolve to.
Okay, so the recommendation is, and we do that right now before the meeting starts, the recommendation is that we receive and consider the verbal written submissions. Do we have someone to move that, please?
I'm happy to move that, Chair.
And second by Tom. Do you wish to speak? You got a minute, Paul.
Have I?
Yeah.
Really? Well,
I think I'd like to hear from you for that minute.
I'm really looking forward to hearing all the verbal submissions that people are coming in with. I'm pleased that we have been able to organise them in a much more orderly fashion than we did for the long-term plan. And hopefully I'm going to learn something over the next 3 days.
Thank you, Paul. Tom?
Nothing to add.
Okay, we have a move and a second. All those in favour? Aye.
Aye.
And I think we can, we will start straight into the submissions. So, Bill, we'd like to welcome you here, and your son too, for accompanying you. Do you both wish to come up? Just one? The floor is yours, Bill.
I get overshadowed by this fellow.
Yeah, well, they don't want that. It's the same with my sons, mate. Leave them alone. Right, just come up to the front. And now you have an overhead, don't you?
I have a what?
Do you have a presentation going up?
I have it on paper. It's in front of me.
Oh, okay.
Yep.
Right. So, Bill, we're going to keep the time. We're starting early because we are starting early. I hope you don't mind that.
Not at all.
But we'll keep you to the 10 minutes. So, if you want councillors to talk, then you need to keep you below the 10 minutes.
Okay. Thank you, Rex.
Thank you, Bill. The floor is yours.
I'm Bill Buddo. My family's been farming in Pokawa and in Northern Hawke's Bay, but previously to that, We're a family who were first involved in New Zealand from the late 1700s, farming in the South Island from the 1850s, and for over 100 years in Hawke's Bay. Been involved in freezing works, tourist industry, forestry, and of all things, railing logs out of Wairoa. It's a topical subject. My preferred option is to keep the port with minimal loss of capital. It is promised to grow. My submission is I'd like to cover economics, control risk, and financing of the port. Hawke's Bay owns the port, and Hawke's Bay is a very substantial exporter. This we know. Alternatives to export without Napier Port would be much more expensive, as it's a long way to go to Wellington or Tauranga. A side benefit of being able to export is that the people of Hawke's Bay have hugely benefited from the port's profitability by about 10 million a year. It indicates that the ratepayers are getting 10 million more spending from the councils than they are paying in rates. This is a very privileged position to be in and makes the port an even more important asset for keeping rates manageable while supporting worthwhile projects throughout the bay. The Hawke's Bay Regional Council got the port for free in 1989. No reason to lose it or throw it away. Look what it earns. It's a really good thing to have in the back pocket. You know, I'd like it too. While understanding the port is spending a lot on development, it should have been keeping more aside for future expansion. But we know that interest rates have been low and one makes other decisions. If a substantial part of the port is sold, it appears it would be surplus monies. Will these monies be going into capital investment for a return, or is it freebie with the earning capital being given away? We have to watch that one. Will the council ensure that the return on this excess cash is greater than the 5 million lost by selling half the port? Or is there another political agenda in that the city user contributions, meaning rates, are reduced by selling off capital infrastructure? We shouldn't be losing what we've paid for and what we've got. Control. Selling 49% loses reliable control in effect and still means higher council rates. You've lost half the money per year. Your partner, that is the port buyer, should you sell, will have expectations of what they're entitled to for their investment and risk. And that means our port, with good economical portage, becomes someone else's cash cow. The people of Hawke's Bay will lose half of their voice in determining the direction of our most important asset. What happens when what is best for the people of Hawke's Bay is a decision that negatively impacts on shareholders? Will the shareholders take precedence over the needs of people? You take on a partner, you don't have all the decisions. The future opportunity for offsetting rates is lost forever unless you build a new port at Clifton, Waipatiki. Any other ideas? Wairoa. We may even have a railway line to get it there. Okay, Napier is the only good place for a port in Hawke's Bay. So why lose any of it? Risk. Diversification and investment has been touted as a major plus for the 49% sale option. However, 49% sale jeopardises control and leaves no further opportunity to raise money in the case of earthquakes and other disasters. If a smaller percentage is sold, for example, then when disaster strikes, another part of the port could be sold without relinquishing control. It's important we look after our future. A port in Hawke's Bay has to stay ahead of potential risk. They have we have substantial lessons from the past, earthquakes, for example, and also, can the port be fully insured under the circumstances we've got? The cost of keeping the port ownership to the average ratepayer over 10 years is quoted as $1,000 total added to the rates. That is $100 per year each. At what point would the increased profit of the port start offsetting rates again? I think there's a lot to do there. I understand there will be some ratepayers who will find this out of their reach, but surely there are alternatives to compensate for this in a variety of ways. If the rates of Napier and Hastings are not subsidised by the Regional Council, then there would not be this discussion. Herein lies the problem. We have enjoyed the port as our cash cow, and now that it needs some improvement, we're throwing up our hands in despair. It's not time to review the port, it's time to review the subsidies that surround the councils of Hawke's Bay. Summary. The port is one of the most important assets of Hawke's Bay and very necessary to keep it growing to meet current and future needs. Sure. However, the economics of the port need to be handled better. Ratepayers are now left with the unpalatable choice of selling one of our important assets or going into debt to protect it. It's very important to keep in mind selling a portion of the port will reduce the future ratepayer offset, perhaps costing ratepayers more in the long term than the debt in the short. Should the council vote to sell a portion of the port, it's utterly vital that the excess money freed by the sale is invested in projects that will deliver a return of over $5 million per year. That needs to increase, of course, with the building of the port. Subsidising poplar pole planting has its value, but the fact is that it does not produce money for the council, and ratepayers will need to shoulder that burden. While diversification of risk is good, selling a smaller portion, or none, of the port allows future disasters to be paid for later. This will not be possible if you sell 49% of the port without losing control of this asset. Overall, the port is too valuable an asset to give up in the manner the council is proposing. The expansion should be funded through debt or just enough of the port to be sold to reduce the impact of borrowing on ratepayers. It was built for our future. Please make it happen, keep it, and work through the issue sensibly. To sell the port is not an option. It's a wonderful cash cow. Can't repeat it more for Hawke's Bay councils. Why give it away when it can be earning in full again and potentially more? I don't want to see it given away, and certainly not what it's been paid for. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bill. So we have 2 minutes for questions. Fenton?
Thank you, Mr. Buddo. Just a question with your breadth of business experience. What's your view on having a majority of our income returning assets, if you, as you quite rightly point out, 70+% in one asset? The risk profile must be something we need to consider alongside the profit profile.
Well, the port in itself has been contributing 10 million, and I would imagine quite a lot of that has gone into infrastructure in the cities and other things as well. So there has been a build as a result of the port being owned. Your question is that you're looking at as a capsule that 70% is all in one place. Wow. Not many people have a monopoly on a freight. The Rhine River in Germany's got castles all the way down it. Everyone took a tax off everybody who went past. You've got the port. We've got the port. We've got the port. So you do have a monopoly. It is the desire of every corporation, actually. You've got it. Why give it away?
We have one more quick question. Thanks, Bill. Really appreciated your presentation and your enthusiasm for it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Is Rosalind here? Yes. Rosalind, would you like to come up now? It's a little bit early for you, but if you could, that would be good. Welcome, Rosalind.
Morning. Can everyone hear me?
Yes, you can sit down there and that speak.
I'd rather stand.
You'd rather stand? So, Rosalind, we have 10 minutes, and if you want questions from council, you've got to leave them a bit of time within that 10 minutes.
Sure.
Okay, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I thought I was going to be the first speaker. Good job I'm not. That's a bit of pressure off there. Yeah, good morning everybody. My name is Rosalind Muir. I'm a member of the Hawke's Bay community. I'm a ratepayer and I'm a port worker. That's my port. It's our port. So as a member of the community, as a port worker and as a ratepayer, the threat of having the port sold out from underneath me, that's like being kicked in the butt 3 times. That's how strongly I feel about it. Okay, the Hawke's Bay Regional Council has stated that we need funding for our port and we're committed to maintaining majority ownership. Well, in my opinion, that's simply not good enough. We want to retain full control, full ownership of our port for our community. Once we sell it off, we can't get it back. It's gone. Game over. It should be acknowledged that Hawke's Bay Regional Council is in fact a social entity, not purely a business. There is a social responsibility to the local community to keep and maintain the port for all of us, not just the privileged few that can buy into shares. Selling the port from under our feet with no actual right would be unforgivable by a lot of members of the community. Now, I have a problem with the phrase protecting our ratepayers, which has been used in publications to date. Protecting us from what exactly? Future financial gains and security for our region? That doesn't actually sound like something I wish to be protected from. Yes, there is a risk in having all our eggs in one basket. However, as far as baskets go, the port's a pretty good one. Ports make money, as pointed out by the last speaker. Absolutely they do. You don't need to go too far back in history, or you can go as far as you like. You're going to get the same result. The port is an extremely valuable asset to the region. I think you've got 76% of the council's revenue quoted in the publications. Why on earth would we want to give that up? It's illogical and unreasonable to want to give that up, surely. Yes, there might be another earthquake in Napier that decimates the port. Absolutely. This is New Zealand. We're known as the Shaky Isles. It doesn't mean we should sell everything up sticks and just leave. That's ridiculous. We're Kiwis. We're into the hard graft. We're in it for the long haul. The Kiwi dream has been ownership for a long time. Home ownership for the individual and strategic asset ownership for the community. Privatisation and asset sales are dirty words. Such actions only benefit the very privileged few and leave the rest of the community to struggle. The statement that certain members of the community would struggle with small regional rates increases has been delivered in a slightly misleading way. It hasn't been clarified that well to the masses about how much we're actually talking. Previous speaker said about $1,000, so about $100 a year. Yep, appreciate that is a challenging sum to some people. However, at the end of the day, realistically speaking, there's not that many ratepayers that would struggle with that. It's not easy to buy a house. You've got to have a reasonable income to be able to do it. I know, I've just done this recently, and I don't get a lot of change out of 40. It's actually because of my employment at the port that I was able to buy my first home. So we talk privatisation. That's great for people who've got shares. What about the workers? What happens then? The prime directive then is to generate money. How do we do that in New Zealand? We do that by dropping rates on our workers. Well, that doesn't sit right with me, and I don't think it would sit right with a lot of the community either. In terms of selling a strategic asset, why? For goodness sake, Ports of Auckland are struggling with their location at the moment. The Auckland Council is fighting to keep it in their territory. They want it. They want that revenue stream. They want it long term. Does it make sense to keep Auckland there? No, absolutely not, but they're desperate to keep it. Why would we sell ours? It seems to me that vital infrastructure is something that should absolutely remain community owned, and it's a social responsibility I believe this council has to maintain that. So when I say Napier Port not for sale, I mean that from the bottom of my heart. You've got a load of port workers down there who also mean that. And we can even give you a little demonstration here. Napier Port, guys.
Not for sale.
Absolutely. Thank you very much.
Well done. Okay, so we have some time for questions, councillors. Paul.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. Thank you, Rosalind, for the presentation. Much appreciated. One of the themes that's come up regularly within the submissions that we've had is around comparing the Port of Napier with the Port of Tauranga, and how some people believe it doesn't compare, and some people think Tauranga has been the best thing since sliced bread. Have you got a particular view on how how the Port of Tauranga operates in terms of the effect it may have if we go the same way?
Well, I think that gets a bit tricky because you've got a situation where if you're an employee and you've got shares that you own, you're kind of your own employer as well, and that's a real conflict of interest. I think you'll find the next speaker will cover that a lot better than what I can.
Okay. So,
Peter.
Thanks for your presentation, Rosalind. You used the word retain full control, and I'm sure we're going to hear that quite a bit over the next couple of days. Can you tell me what you mean by full control?
So at the moment, we're fully council owned and we're fully controlled ourselves. As soon as we sell part of it or all of it or lease it, we relinquish either part or all of that control. That's what doesn't sit well with me.
So that sort of implies that the council controls it, but in fact it's got its own board of directors, and the council actually doesn't control the port at all. It just happens to be the 100% shareholder through HBRIC.
Yeah. So you can spin that however you like, really, can't you?
Any other questions? Well, I have one, Rosalind, just one quick one. Do you think if we retain 55% of the shares, and we're imagining that quite a few other shares were picked up by Hawke's Bay residents, that we will still have enough control? Well, you don't want that limit of ownership, but do you think we'll still have the control that's necessary?
I don't feel that we will. I feel that there'll be too much pressure from external forces. And, you know, even if we sold every share locally to somebody who breathes Hawke's Bay, it's not to say they're going to retain those shares. Anyone else can come along and go, here's a big wad of cash, and they're gone. And we've got no control over how that happens or where that control goes.
Okay, thank you. No more questions? Thank you very much, Rosalind. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
well done.
Yeah, when speakers choose not to sit down, can we be assured that people who are watching this on Facebook can still hear?
Watching on Facebook?
Yeah, because I've got quite a few people in Central Hawke's Bay who actually are interestingly sitting through this.
Oh, okay. Really?
Oh, they're watching it online?
Yep.
Yeah.
Put up on the live Facebook.
Yes.
Let us know if you're not getting a feed. Okay.
Why are we using Facebook? Why are we just using...
Because that's what it is. It's a live Facebook stream.
Done then.
Why are we put it live on our own website?
Okay, councillors. Dave,
It's 2018,
can you
Councillor.
make it to the podium, Dave? You get worse every time I see you, mate.
Pursued everywhere as being an
It got worse.
unsatisfactory, unsavoury entity. And here we are supporting them. There's a moral dilemma here.
We've lost control of all our media.
Okay, Dave, welcome. A really big welcome. We have a minute
I
for...
will sit down.
Yeah. So for those councillors who don't know Dave, yeah, he's fallen off a ladder. You know, classic middle-age crisis.
That happened in Warrell
Do you
Day.
have a health and safety inspector somewhere?
Thanks, that.
Take a seat, Dave. For those who don't know Dave, he is an officer of the union at the port, and he attended every meeting bar one, and has made a huge contribution to this whole consultation process. So, Dave, you know the rules. You've got 10 minutes. I'm sure you'll take every 10. If you want councillors to ask questions.
Rex, when have I used the whole 10 minutes? My
you're
message
on.
is generally quite short. As Ros said, and as we all think, that as employees at the port, whether it's union hat, whether it's a ratepayer's hat, or whether it's just a port worker's hat, from a union perspective, we don't want to see the port sold, and that's the message that we have sent out right from the get-go. My concerns after this point, and I've been to about 10 meetings, aside from the meetings, and I just want to acknowledge the fact that Rex came and spoke to the union on 2 occasions independently from all other employees. And out of that, I think we pretty much got the rollover of option 4, which we weren't prepared to have a bar of because of the ramifications of such types of ownership or non-ownership, probably for the want of a better word. So there's just a few things I want to say, and I think pretty much everybody in this room has heard somewhere along the way what I've said, and it's generally been quite brief. But there's just a few things I'd like to say as we sort of come to the end of the public sessions. Napier Port's not for sale. The second one, the post out, I just want to comment on the post out, which was pretty poor. You know, one day my wife and I were driving home, and there's probably 100, 200 copies of the post out, the document, in the ditches at Bayview. And I know there's a lot of people that I've spoken to that still haven't received them, which may or may have an impact on the 3,500 submissions you received. That's a concern to me, because was it truly representational? You could base it off the 3,500 that you've received, but was it truly representational? On account that quite a few people never, I mean, even James told me he never received one. I don't know if he's had it yet, but putting it out with tied up with, you know, documents that people generally throw away, junk mail, you know, one of them was yay thick about the best vaping oil to buy, and the other one was Harvey Norman. And it was put in the middle, and for those that say no junk mail and it's pushed in their letterbox, those would have been screwed up. Why it wasn't a post out to each ratepayer, which it only affects, would have been far better. And I think the Regional Council dropped the ball on that one. The true loss of semi or full privatisation. Our union has suffered through that through the 80s and 90s with rail. We saw the devastation that was caused by privatisation. Even today, with the issues around Transdev Metro in Auckland and Wellington, which is foreign ownership, our union has to keep fighting because they keep trying to undercut conditions and wages. And more recently, you would have seen the strike that was in Wellington, because Transdev were trying to cut wages and cut conditions. I will say, though, you pick your timing when you do it, not on a rugby day. So, you know, we've seen, we bear the scars of privatisation. We know it well. And this brings me to my next point, that any form of privatisation, and the Regional Council has used the Port of Tauranga example, and this is to pick up on your point, Paul. Tauranga happened at the get-go, okay? It's a different set of circumstances and a different set of rules. They needed the cash. It was done right after the harbour boards were dissolved and the port companies were set up. Here we are in midstream, trying to do the same thing. And rest assured, internally, for our union, that has had consequences. And I know that Rex and Rick went to Tauranga to speak to your friend Phil Spanswick, who endeavoured to tell you the outcomes of such types of privatisation. Even though it's mainly Kiwi owned in terms of the share, that has had conflicts because companies come in and undercut, and it's a race to the bottom. Because you take the cranes, for example, there are now 3 companies vying to use those the gantry cranes in Tauranga, which causes conflict. It causes conflict for our union. And this is what happens whether it's full or semi-privatisation. I've spoken enough about the Port of Melbourne and the conflicts of total privatisation. And for bona fide unions, and what I'm talking about is CTU affiliated unions, this has its difficulties. And it's a constant fight to get business. These things you people don't see, but we see it every day. It also undermines health and safety. Some companies have a lacklustre approach to business. And there are instances, and I'm not going to name companies, but some of you will know the way that those companies operate, even in Napier. And it's concerning, because the Port of Napier has a good health and safety record, in my view, and do a lot of work to keep us on top. And we are ahead of other ports, I'll say it. From a fiscal perspective, we were told at the last meeting at the Port of Napier by our CEO that where we're picking up from, because I brought around the argument of fiscal responsibility, that we're starting from here. We're not starting from here. We can't be starting from here because we already have a debt that we need to clear. We've got an $90 million debt. So we're not starting from here. We need to review the past to see where we're going into the future, because selling the port will come at a risk, and Rex has even told me that. It will come at a risk, both because the shipping industries, as well you all know, at times cause conflict amongst the ports. There's no ports rationalisation in New Zealand. The government has a strategy, but it's not moving as quickly as the regional council strategy, which concerns me from a time perspective. In the last 14 years, probably more so, I know since 1990, 1991, James indicated there's been 124 million left behind by the regional council in terms of investment. You want to average that out over since 1990, 91, it's $4 million a year or a little bit less. It's probably been more so since 2004, if you look at the records. So 124 million that's been left invested isn't a huge investment. In 1990, I think a crane cost 2 or 3 million, Phil? The shore cranes? That won't buy half a crane today. So my belief is that more profit should have been left in the port to keep us afloat, rather than creating the debt that we have currently. That's what I meant around fiscal responsibility, because part of this debt, I believe, has conspired to where we're at now, and I do say conspired. So on that note, I will leave it. We are in growth mode. We accept we're in growth mode. We understand that we need to facilitate everything that's going to happen over the next 10 years. We get that. But at the end of the day, this is about the money and who gets the money and how the money is generated. And even for us, option 2 is not good in light of what I've just said. So thank you for your time. Thank you for the 10 meetings I've attended so far, aside from the union ones. And respectfully to the Regional Council, thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dave. We have time for one question.
I left that fine, didn't I?
Yeah, cut that fine.
Yeah, David.
Yes.
Yeah, thanks very much. I assume that you and the union support the development of the new wharf.
Yes.
You do. Thank you.
We're not opposed to the growth. We just think
Got
this is
1
a
minute,
money issue.
Peter.
Oh, so, well, I haven't really got time for a question, but I just wanted to acknowledge your contribution to this consultation process, Dave. I know that you've gone out of your way to be present at those meetings and have your say, and we do appreciate that.
Thank you. Just an acknowledgement to you that in our previous conversation, a semi-apology that Stephen Bradford, senior consultant.
Thank you, Dave. You've got to get well, mate.
Thank you.
Can you operate that machine of yours with that?
I can throw it from here. Consequence of a rolled ankle and it's a fracture of the ankle bone.
From a ladder.
No, don't listen to him. No, I'd just taken down a tree and the ground was uneven and rushing downhill.
Just a slight exaggeration.
Rolled over. I mean, if this is what you have to deal with as council, should fly around, isn't it?
Oh, yeah, good one. Okay, right. Thank you very much. Robert. Welcome, Robert. Well, you sat here, so you know you've got 10 minutes, but it's really good for the council to know who you are for 30 seconds.
30 seconds.
Oh, who you are, and then you can go into your presentation.
Right.
But yeah, so the 10 minutes is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Graham. I won't be long. Rob Arrell, Napier Boys High School teacher, and there is a class being looked after as I speak, so I have to get back there. Thank you very much. I have an interest in I've had an interest in the port for many, many years. It's kind of a family interest. My grandfather Clive Cassidy was involved with the port development as a deputy chairman for many years, and the late Garth Cassidy was my uncle. So I appreciate that Garth may have been on the other side of the fence to Dave, but probably on this issue, I never discussed it with Garth, but I don't know what his feelings would be. So here today, I speak as a ratepayer and an individual. So to quote a recent comment by the Regional Council Chairperson, Mr Graham, Napier Port is the 4th largest in New Zealand, and the central New Zealand economy represents 25% of the country's GDP. I read the letters of the editor. The port directors, port staff and port union workers all support the need for a new wharf. The cost of $142 million is a good investment to protect our growing economy and jobs. I have no argument with Mr Graham's opinion here, and given the support that he has received from the port's expert personnel, he must be right. The question then is, how do we pay the $142 million? As I see it, option A is that we pay up in our rates and fund the project, at the same time retaining full control and maintaining the long-term benefits of being the gateway to 25% of the New Zealand economy. This option is clearly the state capitalist option, where our region fronts up with the necessary investment, we shoulder it ourselves, in order to be the only beneficiary of such investment. I call it the pay now and win later option. The other options, B and C, that we are seriously considering, you as a council are seriously considering, are essentially similar in their outcomes, in that they share the burden of port project development with an outside interest, meaning that the benefit of being gateway to 25% of the New Zealand economy also has to be shared. They are the pay less now, but gain less later options. We also lose full control. And Councillor asked, what is full control? A full control means our decision making is not compromised by other interests. Less than that means that we do compromise our decision making in the interest of Port of Tauranga, for example, or any other interest that may be out there. Option D is a sellout of control in exchange for a fixed income stream. Since control of future developments are entirely lost, there is no guarantee that the future of the port will be based around promoting Hawke's Bay's interests. A New Zealand or a foreign entity with an agenda that promotes another region or another interest may disrupt our benefit as the gateway to 25% of the New Zealand economy. This is the nil cost but hope for the best solution or option. My sincere hope is that councillors choose the pay now and win later option. It may appear to my fellow ratepayers to be the most expensive option, but I would caution them not to buy cheaply. Buying cheap, as we all know, is false economy. Options B, C and D are the cheap options. Look at all those successful and wealthy economies around the world that still own their own strategic assets. Norway's state capitalism with its North Sea oil reserves has been more lucrative for that nation than Britain's free market policies vis-à-vis its own North Sea oil reserves. I believe that our region has a startlingly valuable asset in the Port of Napier, and I would shudder to think that we could lose control or partial control to an outside entity. I'm strongly in favour of option A, the pay now and win later option. As president of the Japan Society and a teacher that took students to Japan recently, I spoke to the mayor of Tamakamai. Tamakamai has a strong relationship with this city, he made no comment about this, but a stevedore who was president of their association came up to me and said, I hear that there's a possibility that the port is to be sold. And he said, don't go down that option. We saw that happen in Greece when they sold a major port to an outside nation. There are dangers in that. I found that interesting that someone over there was following closely our moves here. So, councillors, please deliberate carefully on our behalf, and thank you for this opportunity to speak.
Thank you, Robert. That was really well put. Stay there because we have some questions. Debbie.
Yep, Debbie.
Thanks, Robert.
How do you do?
I've known Garth and Barbie for many years.
Yep.
I've seen Garth just about most weeks, every week, until he passed away.
Yes.
And you'll know he didn't have an opinion at the end on this. Are you aware that Barbie has submitted in favour of...
No, I'm not aware of that, but that's fine.
Just out
Barbie
of
will have
interest.
her... Yeah,
Yeah,
that's
I
fine.
respect you were submitting on
Yeah.
your own. So thank you, and I'd just like to acknowledge the input that your grandfather and uncle have had in building this region and the port.
Thank you, Debbie.
Thank you. Paul.
Thank you, Robert. The pay now, win later option obviously is an impost on the would need to mean that the ratepayer would have to contribute something to the port development one way or the other. Either how do you think we should explain that to the people who are least able to afford that?
I can understand that, and there was another letter to the paper that illustrated that very clearly, that the pay now, win later, really the cost is the same to the ratepayer all the way through, because if you shoulder the brunt at the moment or take loans or whatever you deliberate on, then the cost will be borne later on anyway. In another way, it's defrays the cost. It has to be spent. If you choose the other options, then the ratepayers lose out the benefit that may have been gained. So it's not as visible, is it? It's far more visible to see that upfront cost immediately, and people react emotionally and don't see that, well, if you don't do it properly now, as in if you buy cheaply now, you will pay a cost later on. The advice is don't buy cheaply, and it's good advice for a solid reason. So that's how I would advise you to discuss it with the ratepayers, because by taking these other options, we are buying more cheaply.
Thank you. Are there any other questions?
I've got one. Are you aware that the papers put out said that one of the options, if sold the shares, then the money that would be gained from that could be invested and would more than offset any projected return from the port?
I think with that is that Norwegian option, isn't it? Which is where the sale perhaps to another interest.
But the point I'm making to you is you're claiming it as if there's the sale of the shares incurs a loss, whereas the papers say that the sale of the shares incurs a gain as well, portraying that as a loss, when in fact the other paperwork says the other way around.
Yeah, I think the argument was made by one of the union workers earlier on that that doesn't discount the lack of control that you then have in the other.
But that's not a loss.
No.
The second question I have for you...
And those investments have
sorry,
to be
we don't have time for a second question.
Yeah.
Oh, I was just warming up.
I know. We don't have time.
I'll cool down.
Thank you very much, Robert. Really appreciate that.
Thank you.
Yeah, I think you put it really succinctly, and that's why you wanted so many questions, but that's why you got so many questions.
Thanks very much.
We don't have time. Back to those kids.
Yep, thanks, Mr. Rowe.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Simon Beale. Simon Beale here?
Yes.
Yes. Is that
I
Simon?
got a letter from Barbie the other day because I sort of sent her a note.
No. So Simon Beale's not here. You're not Simon Beale, no.
Gordon's here.
Gordon.
Patrick Maloney.
Or Patrick.
Patrick Maloney.
Patrick Malone here? No. So Gordon, if you don't mind, being a bit early. You might have been grabbing you, Mark. If you...
Like that before I get too nervous.
Well, no need to get nervous here, Gordon. So.
I hope so.
So you would have heard you have 10 minutes, and if you want to leave some for councillors, you need to within that 10 minutes.
Yeah.
And you know, councillors are really keen to hear what everyone's got to say. So
thank you very much.
No need to be nervous. What was yours?
Right, I came back to the Hawke's Bay in 1994. I'd been working as a consultant for AFCO in the early 1990s, and they needed an engineering manager in 1994. What many people won't know is that AFCO was ready to close AFCO Wairau in 1994 because they'd been trying to sell off the operation and it needed a hell of a lot of work on it. After my contract was up, I decided to stay in Wairau, and I now live in Nuhaka, and I've got business interests in Auckland and Northland. I'll read my submission, or the addendum to my submission, because that way I'll stay on track rather than wandering and keep to the 10 minutes. When I posted my submission to you 3 weeks ago, I recommended that the Port Authority, as a leading and absolutely essential player in the Hawke's Bay economy, leans as heavily as it can on the government to become an equity partner in future port development, so that the ownership of the port remains completely in unadulterated public ownership. I also recommended that Stuart Yule, and at that time I'd forgotten about Lawrence Yule, need to be completely on board with this concept, and government bureaucrats and advisors should be given no wiggle room to sidestep this opportunity to avoid future New Zealand Railways type fiascos via the likes of Fay Rich White type enterprises, privatisation, buybacks and everything that goes with it. Those recommendations were based on the information that had been provided by the Hawke's Bay Regional Council in your flyer, and that was before I had the opportunity to analyse the business history of the port. What I have since discovered is that the Hawke's Bay Regional Council is virtually the steward of the port, and did not have to buy it or invest any capital in it. 2, over the period of 28 years, the dividends that the Hawke's Bay Regional Council have taken average out to 60% of the total profit after tax. 3, borrowings have been structured so that the port now has a debt of nearly $90 million. 4, if Hawke's Bay Regional Council had even allowed itself a generous dividend of 20% of profit after tax, over the 28 years it would have still received $43 million. 5, the port could have retained the other 40%, which equates to $86 million, approximately the debt that the port is now in. I now suggest that the Hawke's Bay Regional Council retrieves all money it has invested elsewhere and borrows as required so that the port can be returned to debt-free status. Secondly, I recommend that the Hawke's Bay Regional Council relinquish its stewardship of the port company after the debt has been cleared, or be relieved of its governance role and the port company be put under a separate independent board of experienced, competent, preferably local directors who can administer the port for the good of those using it, for the port itself and for the citizens of the wider Hawke's Bay. Any further development of the port cannot be considered until the overall governance of the port is put on a firm, conservative, non-predatory base. When that has been achieved, a port that is already turning over nearly $90 million worth of business a year and making a profit after tax of more than 15% should have no trouble raising the necessary finances to continue its own development and growth. My original submission suggested that central government, through its Regional Development Fund, should invest in the port. Having been able to analyse the business history, I conclude that the port, especially since 2000 when it returned to a zero debt status, could have been managed to maintain its zero debt status. Taking dividends ranging from 50.5% in 2001 right up to 83% in 2010 has resulted in the port company being in the debt situation it is in now. My recommendation now is that the Hawke's Bay Regional Council settles the debt of the port and puts the port under truly independent, competent directorship. If it cannot do this, both the port and the Hawke's Bay Regional Council need to be put under statutory management. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. I have a first question. Are you aware that the port does have an independent board of directors and independent chair?
I'm aware of that, but I'd question the validity of the word independent.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Neil.
Yeah, thanks for your submission. Just a little interested in the debt situation for the port. Are you saying that the council over a number of years has been too harsh on the port by extracting dividends that have created debt? Is that where you're coming from? Sure.
That's exactly where I'm coming from.
Wouldn't that be the same if we had, I mean, we've got two charges here. One is if we sell down a share, then those independent private shareholding would demand and grab too much out, and yet on the other side you're saying that we've done that over anyway. So I'm just trying to see where the balance is between...
Yeah, well, what I'm recommending here is not actually private shareholding, which would definitely gouge, all right? What I'm saying is it goes into public ownership, all right? So it's managed for the good of the community, the port, and its customers. And that governance takes on the thing that it takes between a 10 and a 20% return on investment over the long term, rather than, like I say, there's lots of years when it's in the 70s and the 80s over the last 15-year period.
You think it should carry any debt at all?
The port?
Yes.
Oh, definitely. But what I think you should do is let the port get back to its debt-free status, and so then let it manage itself as far as its further development is concerned.
Thank you. Any other questions? Peter.
It's more a comment than a question. You're probably aware that the shareholding structure is there's HBRC, and then there's a regional investment company, which the HBRC is fully owns, and the investment company owns 100% of the shares in the port. You've implied that they don't act independently. Well, I'm a director of HPRIC, and I have to put on the public record that you are wrong. They are completely independent, and we don't have any directive control over the port board.
Thank you, Peter.
Yeah, well, right. I stick with what I say.
Yeah, that's fine. So we have time for one quick question.
Can I just ask you, though, just to be fair to what Peter has said, if you're going to assert something, then you need to put something of substance on the deck that says that it's not independent. To be fair to him, you can't just say, oh, well, I believe this, therefore it's right. So if you're going to say something, you need to have a fact or two at least,
Well, I don't think we need to bring that conversation up at the moment. I look at it from a business point of view, and for up to over 80% of the profit after tax to be coming back to your investment company year after year after year. I've got a son who's in business, and a private business, and they take 100% out, so the staff won't spend it. I know how that system works. all right? This is where I look at the port and I look how fine it is and how well it operates and what have you, and I think the figures that fell out for me, Rick, was that, hey, you know, there's a $90,000 debt on the port, and virtually 40% of the profit that the council has taken out almost equates dollar for dollar with that amount. And so the point that I made in my submission that I read to you was that if it had been managed from 2000, they could have kept that port actually at a debt-free status rather than stacking up debt on the port while still taking dividend out the other side.
Thank you, Gordon. We have run out of time. Thank you very much for your very comprehensive. Just wondering whether you know Toro Waka.
Can I just ask a question? Not of Gordon.
I do.
No, you can't.
No, not of Gordon. I want to ask a question. In
Thanks,
the light
Gordon.
of what Gordon said, this graph that you gave us last week, I'm wondering whether we can run some copies of it, because it addresses quite directly a point that Gordon's made in terms of the level of dividend that the council's received over time.
Yes, I'd like a copy of that one too.
Thank you.
Is it possible?
We have
For
discussed.
Gordon now?
Well, just there's 2 days of submissions. There's going to be other people saying the same thing.
Yeah, okay, yeah. We are proposing to have it run on the Hawke's Bay today on the weekend.
What's the noise over there? Yes.
Thank you.
Someone ringing me up.
That was them being naughty.
Mr Chairman, I've got a view that we shouldn't be arguing with submitters.
No, I have a view as
They're
well.
expressing their opinion.
You know,
We have ours.
I thought I covered that at the beginning, actually. Can we, Peter, can we just settle down that?
The challenge is not unreasonable.
Councillors, I don't want to argue. I think Alan's right. We don't want to argue with submitters. It's their moment to tell us, and you absorb it and think it, and we can talk about it later. But, I mean, Peter was raising a governance position, and it's a valid question, but I think it takes up too much of their time. Okay.
Just make a point too in terms of history. When the port came over to the Regional Council in 1990, it came over with debt that the Regional Council had to pay.
Alan, you're just doing exactly what you said we shouldn't be doing.
No, I'm sorry. I think people have forgotten that.
Yes, I know.
It's just a matter of perspective.
There's a whole lot of stuff.
Just a matter of perspective. For him, it's making good points. For you, it's an argument.
Okay, Simon Beale, has Simon turned up yet? No. Then Patrick, are you have your... So welcome, Patrick, and thank you very much for submitting. You weren't here, so I'll just tell you how we're doing this. We have 10 minutes, and if you want councillors to have time for questions, then your presentation should be less than 10 minutes. We have to, in fairness to everyone, keep everyone to the time frame. So the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mr Chairman, and I had time for about 10 minutes, but hopefully we've still got time for questions at the end. Thank you, councillors, and good morning to everybody. As I've indicated in my written submission, I support option A. You have recommended against this on the basis that it's not affordable to ratepayers, and the cost being about $900 per ratepayer to repay the $86 million of the historic port debt. Now, when the $900 or $956 is amortised over 10 years, it is actually less than $2 a week, and if it's amortised over 25 years, which is a reasonable time period, given the expected life of the port, then it is about $1 a week. Now, this is less than half a cup of coffee or 1 or 2 hours on a parking meter, and I've just paid more than this to park outside the building to come to the meeting. That puts it in some perspective. The presentation of this is a lump sum, upfront cost of the $956, and converting that into a 45% rate increase provides for a dramatic headline, because it is calculated off a relatively low base figure, being your standard annual rates, which for people are about $200+. The real dollar cost per week, however, is actually very small. Secondly, regarding the issue of affordability, I do need to make the point that the average price rise
of a residential property in the Hastings or Napier district in the last 12 months was about $75,000. Now that's 75 times the upfront full 10-year cost of the 900. And in the previous year, property price values and wealth increase was a similarly large multiple of the $900. All property owners in the region have had huge capital and wealth gains in recent years. And yet you are still saying $900 over 10 years is too much to pay. This cost is less than 1% of the historic wealth gains of recent years. And thinking of the people in Central Hawke's Bay, well, their property prices have increased by over 55% in the last 3 years. This would probably be more than $100,000 per household. In Wairoa, the property value increases in the last couple of years have been about 40%. Clearly, the $900 is affordable when put into perspective of these relative wealth gains. You, however, have based your recommendation of sale of the port on the basis it is not affordable. I just disagree. Now, I'm surprised as part of your justification for the urgent need to build the new wharf is to cater for the cruise ship tourism industry. On this point, I need to remind you all that you have just spent much of the last 2 years in a budget process to reduce the amount of financial assistance the Council provides to promote tourism. For the last couple of years, you've been working very hard to reduce the assistance to tourism by thousands of dollars. Now, however, you have completely reversed your view from reducing your support by thousands of dollars to the urgent need to now spend millions of dollars to provide for the expansion of the cruise ship visits. Your position now is the complete opposite of your position 1 or 2 years ago. Now, while focusing on the cruise ship aspect of your argument to support the port, I feel the need to draw your attention to the pollution impacts of these cruise boats. You have made much of your priority of being good environmental stewards, and that I commend you, and that is your top priority. The cruise ships, however, purchase very cheap bunker fuel. It is heavily laden with sulphur content, which adds significantly to air pollution, nitrous oxide and sulphur dioxide. There was a report recently, I don't know if you've seen it, on this pollution impact in Wellington. A cruise ship exhaust from a ship berthing for the day is the equivalent of an extra 200,000 vehicles in Wellington City. And it will be the same out here in Napier. Given your environmental care ambitions, it's time to also think about the dirty aspects of tourism, and especially that from cruise boats. There are no marine air pollution regulations to control this exhaust pollution, but it is a serious negative that needs to be taken into account when you are thinking about the desirability of spending millions of dollars to encourage even more ships to come to Napier. I also query the pro-private sector financial advisor's advice that says to you selling the port is the superior option. It reminds me of the 1980s and 1990s, when Fay and Richwhite were all over the government of the time on the need to sell the railways because they were not really that viable. And so private sector shareholders would be better managers. Well, at the end of the day, the robber barons bought the railways themselves, stripped all the cash they could from the business, and left it in a worse financial position. They captured all the value for themselves, and that's partly why we've got the problem with the railway from here to Gisborne, Wairoa and Gisborne. Fay and Richwhite stripped it. Another good, or perhaps poor example of selling infrastructure assets is the electricity generation system of the old Electricity Corporation. Yes, there were profits for new private sector investors, but at huge expense to the taxpayer and the consumer. We do not seem to have learnt the lessons from our previous record of selling infrastructure assets, and especially monopoly enterprises. If you had asked an economist with expertise in public sector economics and infrastructure development, such as Jeff Bertram of Wellington, then I think you would get a different set of advice as to the best way forward. In your promotional material, you refer to the success of the port at Tauranga, with the implicit interpretation that the private shareholding for Tauranga has been important in its success. This implicit suggestion is, in my view, overstating the merits of private shareholding. Tauranga as a location, has enormous natural business advantages. It is a deep water and well-protected port. It is the closest port to the central North Island forest and log exports. It has the very big kiwi fruit export volume from the Bay of Plenty. It is the gateway to the Waikato with its very large dairy business. It is the gateway for the tourist travel bound for Hobbiton at Matamata and Rotorua. It is also a viable port option for the South Auckland industrial hub. These are the real reasons Tauranga is successful, not its private shareholding. Now, the predicament you now have and the way you have presented the options reminds me of the Ruataniwha Dam debate and the Central Hawke's Bay water supply issue. It is much the same issue. Both are man-made problems. In the case of the Ruataniwha Dam, you over-allocated the available water, thinking you could do so without any problem and keeping everybody in Central Hawke's Bay quite happy. Well, we now know this is not the case. With the port, you have over the years over-allocated the dividend from the port so you would look good by keeping your rates below the level they would otherwise need to be. You have also increased your planned debt levels in the 10-year plan to finance your other environmental works. The combination of these two financial decisions has left you in the current position of trying to unwind the predicament of the port, now not having enough of its own reserves to finance its expansion. The current situation would not have arisen if a higher percentage of profits had been retained by the port as part of its funding for future years, and if you had not approved the substantial borrowing to fund your other planned programs. There would just be a lot more flexibility at the moment. Your published material suggests that you anticipate a higher port profit profile in future years from a combination of increased volumes and higher charges. This is where the private sector investors and advisors clearly see an opportunity for good returns on any sale of the port. That is why they are keen to buy the shares. They've probably told you so. These higher forecast profits should instead, in my view, be retained by the port and used to finance the borrowing now required for capital expenditure. These profits are likely to be there for a very long time, given the expected life of the assets. Selling half the port is paying away half the profits and half the dividends that would otherwise accrue to ratepayers. This is an immediate loss and cost to all of our ratepayers. Retaining ownership would ensure that the forecast profit gains will be shared by the whole community and not just a number of well-to-do investors.
Thank you, Patrick. You've had your 10 minutes. I'm sorry. Do you want to wind up just quickly?
Well, in conclusion, I would like to say that if you ask a slightly different question, you usually get a different answer, and especially if you ask someone different. And that's why I've suggested perhaps a peer review, and I think there are alternative financing options of trimming and spreading your borrowing program. It's a long-term program, perhaps increasing the port charges and seeking better profitability, retaining more of the dividends, having another look at the construction timetable. In the end of the day, though, I think it is affordable, and I recommend keeping the ownership of the port.
Thank you very much. There is no questions, Rick. Sorry.
Well, of you.
Sorry?
Of you.
Of what?
Well, I'd like to ask a question of you, if I can.
Well, thanks, Patrick.
It says, I see that Patrick's reading from his prepared script. I was wondering if you would like to invite him, Chair, to forward a copy of that to you for distribution to councillors, so we can read it in full.
I think that'd be very good. Would you do that, Patrick?
Yeah, no problem, Mr. Chairman and Mr. Barker. My instructions were to bring 12 copies of material, which I've done. I've got 12 copies here.
Excellent.
Oh, great. Thank you.
So, yeah,
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. No, I'll leave that with...
Sorry, we're not taking questions from the floor. We're not taking questions from the floor.
just making a comment, Rex, that it's only 10:11 and Patrick wasn't due to start till 10:10.
No, but in fairness to everyone, it's 10 minutes. Otherwise, I get into big trouble at the end of the day. They say, "Oh, you gave Patrick 12. I want 12." So I'm really sorry.
You can give it to Mr. Barker to ask his questions.
Yeah, I know, but he I can't control him. Actually, we do. Simon Beale hasn't arrived yet, has he? So, Mark, we do have time for you if you...
Well, I'd be quite happy to cede my time to Patrick because I think you've got the...
No. Mark, do you wish to give your... Or do you want to wait and we break for a cup of tea?
Keep it on, please.
Thank you, Mark. Appreciate that.
And not taking advantage.
So who we got?
So,
Who's this?
Sorry?
Who's this, Rex?
This is Mark Sweet. He's an old friend of mine.
I was very brief in my...
Mark,
Yes.
so, it's 10 minutes. We have to keep the 10 minutes, I'm afraid, if you
I know,
do one.
I know.
And then we're going to break for a cup of tea. So I really appreciate you coming on early. And perhaps if you could introduce yourself.
I will. Morena councillors, my name is Mark Sweet. I do not support council's preferred option of selling shares in the Port of Napier, simply because it isn't necessary. And I urge councillors to consider alternatives, some of which don't appear in your consultation documents. The $350 million over 10 years required for port expansion can be acquired with less risk by other means while maintaining 100% ownership. I am an advocate of a banded approach, which would see the development capital raised by various means that could include an increase in rates, borrowing, targeted charges on those who benefit most from the port, the exporters and the importers, and perhaps a bond issue. As a Napier resident, I'm paying around $250 regional council rates a year, and as a commercial property owner in Waipukaro, Hastings and Napier with others, we pay around $9,000 regional rates a year. And I would be happy to pay up to 25% more if it meant not selling shares in the port. So personally, I'd be prepared to forgo over $2,000 a year if it meant not selling shares in the port. Extrapolating a 25% rate increase over 10 years at today's rates income of around 20 million is around 50 million. So we've got 300 million to go. Borrowing has really been cheaper and can be as low as 3% in today's market. With current debt of 86 million in the port, you could borrow another 50 million tomorrow and still be under a safe asset loan ratio. So we've got 250 million to go. Current exports from the Port of Napier are around 4 billion, imports around 1 billion. There are mechanisms by which the port could clip the ticket. If values of imports, exports were taxed at just 0.5%, that would collect $20 million a year in user pay charges. That's 200 million over 10 years. So we have to find another 50 million, and that could be raised in a bond issue, which might be attractive to institutional investors who on today's returns could accept as low as 5%. I know my calculations are off the cuff, and all I'm trying to do is point out that selling shares in the port is not the only option, and I'd urge council to be more imaginative than to choose the privatisation solution to raising the capital to port expansion. And frankly, $11 million to spin the wheel seems really extravagant. It's hard not to appear political on the issue of asset sales, privatisation, public-private partnerships, whatever you may wish to call the phenomena, where assets held in collective public ownership are transferred to individual private ownership. And it's hard to determine what is the most powerful driving influence of the notion of asset privatisation. Certainly, there is a thirst fueled by pension funds, mutual funds, private equity funds, and wealthy individuals for the acquisition of assets, whatever they may be. Of course, shares in the Port of Napier are attractive to investors, but please don't be hoodwinked by the notion that local mum and dad investors will be the benefits of privatisation. Because as with all the asset sales in New Zealand in the last 3 decades, over time, the majority of shares end up in the hands of institutional investors. Your consultation documents maintain council will have much the same control over the port as you do now, but that's not true. Currently, the port structure and management is pretty transparent, but that will cease if you include private investors. As with other public-private partnerships, commercial confidentiality will mask off-balance sheet accounting, securitization, secondary financing, and other hidden mechanisms no longer transparent for your scrutiny. Also in the consultation process, Council has cited the Port of Tauranga, and I'm sort of repeating what Paddy said here. You've cited the Port of Tauranga as a model of successful public-private partnership, but there is no evidence that the Port of Tauranga would have been any less successful had it been kept in 100% public ownership. The growth of the Port of Tauranga coincides with the massive expansion in dairying in the central North Island, and not surprisingly, Fonterra is their biggest customer. Furthermore, the Port of Wellington, until an earthquake, thrived without privatisation. So all I'm saying is it's disingenuous to try and justify the sale of our port by exempling Tauranga. I see it as a fault of Local Government Act rather than council, that a preferred option must be presented in the special consultation process. As with past consultation processes in Hawke's Bay, the preferred option is the one developed most, given the most grunt, and soon appears the only option. I really urge councillors to consult more widely from experts other than those favouring privatisation, and keep open minds in seeking other means, of which there are plenty in raising capital for port development. There's no urgency in this matter. The planned port expansion can begin today with current resources. And I just don't see there is a need to sell down the port. That's me, under 10 minutes.
Yeah, well under.
Questions?
Yes, there is. Do we have questions? Thank you very much, Mark. That was excellent.
Same question. Can we get a copy of that?
Yeah, I've got it. I just did this at 6 o'clock this morning.
Are there any other questions?
I haven't got a printer. Can I send it by email?
Email it.
Yes.
Yeah, cool. I can do that if you give me an email address and hook me up. Yep.
Paul.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Mark. Great. I really enjoyed that presentation. You talked about a mixture of raising funds other than, you talked about a mix, and I made a note that you got the rates increase, raising charges and bonds.
Yep.
I thought there were 4 that you'd mentioned.
Yeah, you could raise the rates, clip the ticket by charging the exporter-importers. You could raise a bond issue. And what was my other one? Increased rates, borrowing.
Oh, borrowing,
you can still
right.
borrow.
Okay.
Yeah, so it's really 4 there, but I'm sure there are more other ways.
Yep. So just to follow on from that question, if that's okay, Chair.
Yeah, sure.
It's the challenge that confronts me when we look along, especially the raising of the bonds and the borrowing, is the issue of debt to equity ratios and about them becoming unpalatable. Have you got any idea of any solutions around that particular side of the equation? Because the servicing part of it is fine. You can raise rates or raise charges, but the security side of it is another issue.
Well, I've got two things to say there. Some of the biggest users of the port don't contribute much except, you know, their charges for using the port. And I think of PanPac. Now, PanPac is absolutely reliant on the Port of Napier. Surely PanPac could be approached to loan $25 million or something over 10 years at a low interest rate. And there's another, there's an apple grower who has got an idea that the pip fruit industry should be the ones who own the privatisation of the port. Well, rather than those pip fruit growers who are profiting so much, perhaps they could be approached to contribute in some sort of bond issue or loaning to the port. I'm just asking for a bit of more imagination than this single, easy solution, privatisation, which hasn't served New Zealand well at all.
Thank you, Mark. There was no time for it. We've got 14 seconds to go, so we're well in.
Oh.
Thank you very much. That was a really good presentation, despite you did it at 6 o'clock in the morning. Hope you had a good coffee.
Well, my pleasure.
Appreciate that. So we're going to break for a cup of tea now.